Just before we get started today, a word from our fantastic sponsor. Look, are you stressed about what to eat, especially after a long day? Well, discover the magical world of Cook Unity. Imagine this. You're wrapped up in work, deadlines are looming, and all you have to worry about is what delicious meal Cook Unity is providing for you tonight. Cook Unity is not just a meal service, it is a chef collective bringing the creativity of award-winning chefs right to your table. No more compromising on taste or on health. It's easy. All you have to do is choose a subscription plan and select from hundreds of meals, each prepared by award-winning chefs. If you can't or don't have time, Cook Unity is happy to select meals for you based on your taste preferences. These chefs aren't just cooking meals, they're crafting experiences. Take Chef Andres Mendez from New York, for example. His spaghetti squash with beef meatballs is a must-try. Picking up Cook Unity is easy. Step 1, tell them your preferences. Step 2, pick your meals for a variety curated by real chefs. And here's the best part. Meals delivered fully cooked, so all you have to do is heat them up. Dinner is done in as little as 5 minutes. No more cleanup, no more meal planning. Every week is a culinary adventure with 50+ chefs from top restaurants. Try the penne with turkey bolognese from Chef Dustin Taylor. The subscription is super flexible. You can choose from 4 to 60 meals per week. Meal plans are flexible and commitment-free. Skip deliveries, pause, or cancel anytime. Find these and more at cookunity.com/shadows50. And as a cherry on top, use the code SHADOWS50 to get 50% off your first order. So don't stress about dinner tonight. Cook Unity have got your back. Head to cookunity.com/shadows50 or click the link below and use the code SHADOWS50 to try it out. Thank you to Cook Unity for sponsoring, and now into today's video. There is something uniquely horrible about maritime disasters. The chaos, the panic, the inevitable mass loss of life in a manner so cruel as drowning. As a result of this, such disasters have a way of embedding themselves onto our consciousness like no other, and often penetrate the cultural zeitgeist to such an extent that they become modern folklore. The Titanic, the Lusitania, the Empress of Ireland. These are just some of the ships whose tragic loss have managed to achieve a level of mass notoriety. But did you know none of those sinkings, despite how lamentable they were, come anywhere close to being the most deadly? That nefarious title would go to the sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, a German passenger liner whose loss resulted in the deaths of nearly 10,000 people. And this is the story of what befell her doomed passengers. Commissioned by the Strength Through Joy organization of the German Labour Front, the Wilhelm Gustloff was built by Blom & Voss shipyard in Hamburg, Germany, with her keel being laid down in 1936 and her construction being completed by mid-1937. She was originally due to be named Adolf Hitler, but this was later changed to Wilhelm Gustloff in honor of the leader of the Swiss Nazi Party who had been assassinated during her construction. Her primary purpose was to provide German workers with opulent state-subsidized jaunts across European waters as part of the Nazi regime's wider efforts to promote social welfare and national solidarity among the working class. She was also intended to act as a 25,000-ton propaganda poster, a floating testament to the supposed benefits of National Socialism that would espouse the regime's glory wherever she sails. For her initial service, this was exactly what she did. She was absolutely state-of-the-art by 1937 standards and was adorned in trappings so opulent and luxurious that she seemed almost otherworldly to the few Germans lucky enough to win tickets to cruise on her. But she wasn't all form over function, as alongside her bourgeois facade sat a wealth of facilities to ensure that her passengers had the greatest possible time. Swimming pools, libraries, cinemas, she had it all. During her time as a cruise ship, she sailed to numerous destinations, including the Mediterranean and Norwegian fjords, and made the dream of vacationing at sea a reality for thousands of German workers who could never have afforded such a luxury otherwise. She wasn't long-lived in that role, however, because as Hitler's maniacal expansionist whims crept ever onwards, she found herself increasingly being pulled from civilian efforts in order to assist war efforts. Spending April 1938 anchored off the coast of England, where she acted as a floating polling station for expatriate Germans and Austrians voting in the referendum to annex Austria, and also spending May through June 1939 delivering the Condor Legion, Germany's expeditionary force in the Spanish Civil War back home. Eventually, in September 1939, with the outbreak of World War II, she was pulled from civilian service fully and would spend the rest of her days flying a military flag. Life under the Kriegsmarine Command was a mixed bag for the Gustloff. For the first year or so, she was used as a hospital ship and spent her days hugging the coastline of whatever country Germany was invading that week. Then, from November 1940, with the Allied blockade making the sea far too dangerous for her to traverse, she was moored in Poland and used as a floating barracks for U-boat trainees for several years. Eventually, as Germany's fortunes in war continued to worsen and the Red Army began to loom on the borders of the heartland, she was cut loose from her moorings and assigned to Operation Hannibal, the mass evacuation of German citizens from Courland, East Prussia, and Pomerania. And it was on this operation that she would meet her cruel fate. On the 30th of January 1945, the Gustloff steamed out of Gdynia in occupied Poland, bound for Germany. The atmosphere on board was pretty tense, to say the least. The Gustloff, originally intended to be a poster boy for the glory of Nazism, was now little but a monument to its delusions. Barefooted refugees trampled their dirty feet through luxurious carpets, and the once grand swimming pool now stood dry, packed shoulder to shoulder with female auxiliaries who were just happy to be alive and were sparing no thought to luxury. So crammed was the Gustloff that the ship intended to carry 1,900 now had 10,852 souls on board, a weight of people so vast that she sat several feet deeper in the water than she usually would. Amidst this human mass was the full spectrum of Nazi society. Fanatical SS soldiers and ignorant conscripts, wailing babies and exhausted elders, countryside peasants and cosmopolitan industrialists. They were all a desperate diaspora, united by one thing: a wish to live. As evening came and darkness descended upon the icy waters of the Baltic Sea, the Gustloff pressed ever on. She had just one destroyer shadowing her for protection, the Lowe, as this late in the war, with the German military being so overstretched, there was simply nothing else available. But a single ship was not nearly enough to ensure her safety, so in real terms, pure dumb luck was the only thing that stood between her and the bottom of the Baltic Sea. To make matters worse, the Gustloff was lit up like a Christmas tree. Her captain, Friedrich Peterson, had opted to take a course through deep water rather than hugging the coastline, and so he lit up all of her navigation lights in order to better avoid both ice and German minesweepers that were operating in the area. Following this choice, one of his subordinates declared to the bridge that such a choice was suicidal, and it was only a matter of time until they were spotted by the Soviet Navy. Tragically, that officer was not wrong in his assertion, as a little before 9 p.m. the Gustloff was spotted through the periscope of Alexander Marinesko, captain of the Soviet submarine S-13, who, upon recognizing the prime target that had fallen into his lap, immediately made the choice to attack. He took his time to line the S-13 up perfectly, ensuring that he had a nice, clean shot directly onto the side of the Gustloff, and then he barked at his men to fire and unleashed a volley of 3 torpedoes against her. The attack was simply devastating. The first torpedo struck Gustloff on her port side at 9:16 p.m. and caused immediate and severe damage, blasting a gaping hole in the ship's side and sending a huge plume of water into the air. The hole had formed right beside her crew quarters. The lucky ones were killed instantly by the blast, and the unlucky ones drowned under the enormous weight of water that is now pouring into their quarters. The second torpedo impacted soon after, striking the hull beside the swimming pool that was housing all of the female auxiliaries. The force of the blast blew right through the locker rooms immediately beside the hull and through into the swimming pool itself, turning the beautiful tiled mosaics adorning the walls into deadly shrapnel that tore the women inside to pieces. Unfortunately, being in the center of the ship, the blast that reached through to the pool wasn't strong enough to grant those inside the mercy of a quick death, and they were forced to suffer the dual pain of lacerations from shrapnel and drowning as they met their ends. Ultimately, only 3 of the 373 women quartered in the area would survive the wreck. Then, with water already pouring into the Gustloff through 2 great holes, the third torpedo hit, scoring a direct hit on her engine room, which was located amidship. There was only a skeleton crew manning the engine room at the time, so initial casualties were less than those of the first 2 torpedoes, but the hit was no less devastating because not only did the Gustloff now have a third great hole letting in vast quantities of the Baltic's cold, icy waters, but the engine room had been completely destroyed, as a result of which she immediately lost all power and communications. She was now both literally and figuratively in the dark. Panic immediately took hold of the stricken ship following the torpedo blasts. Passengers and crew alike began fumbling through the dark, frigid corridors, desperately seeking a path to safety. Some were lucky, and through muscle memory or pure fluke of fate, they found their way to the top decks. But many more were not. They were trapped by the damage and left with no route of escape, trampled by other desperate passengers, or simply being unable to find their way out of the belly of the ship before the ever-rising waters caught up to them. Not that making it to the top deck guaranteed survival either, as the lifeboat situation couldn't have been much worse. The Gustloff, being so over capacity, simply didn't have enough for everyone, and of the few that she did have, several had been destroyed completely in the torpedo blasts, and many more were frozen solid with ice and proved impossible to free from their davits. Worse still, even some of the operable lifeboats couldn't be used, as most of the crew members trained to get them into the water had been off duty and resting, right next to where the first torpedo had struck, and thus had already perished. Eventually, after 20 or so minutes, the Gustloff began to list heavily, and the further launching of lifeboats became flatly impossible. Sensing little other option, some began throwing themselves from the ship in the vain hope that they might be picked up by one of the few lifeboats that made it onto the water. Very few survived using this desperate strategy, however, with most who attempted it breaking their limbs upon crashing into the water and then drowning. The ones who did survive the fall were largely turned away from the lifeboats and left to drown, as they were already packed far beyond capacity and simply didn't have room to take people on. Of the persistent ones who insisted, a few were eventually allowed to board, but many more were shot in the water, lest they further strain the lifeboats. Shots also started ringing out across the Gustloff around this time, as many of the soldiers on board, believing that their fate was sealed, chose to turn their weapons on themselves and accept a quick death by their own hands, rather than a slow and agonizing one at the hands of the Baltic Sea. For those who couldn't secure a weapon or couldn't bring themselves to pull the trigger, they huddled together and waited for the inevitable. Tragically, they didn't wait very long. By 9:40 p.m, the Gustloff was lying completely on her side, and by 10 p.m, she had disappeared beneath the waves altogether. A rescue effort began the moment the first torpedo landed. Initial efforts were spearheaded by the Lowe, which, thanks to being in a convoy with the Gustloff, was able to respond instantaneously. She immediately informed the Kriegsmarine of the developing situation and was informed that every available ship would be dispatched to assist. She then turned her attention to aiding the survivors, collecting the occupants of the lifeboats that she could find and dispatching her own lifeboats to rescue stricken survivors in the water. 8 other ships soon joined the Lowe: torpedo boat T-36, minesweepers M387, M375, and M314, freighters Gottingen and Gottenland, patrol boat V1703, and torpedo recovery boat TF-19. But even with their help, the recovery effort was fraught with problems. The sea was filled with ice floes, making navigation perilous, and additionally, the heavy seas and strong winds made it extremely difficult to maneuver rescue vessels close to survivors. Ultimately, the responding German forces were able to rescue 1,252 individuals. Tragically, 13 of these survivors later died, bringing the final death toll to a gut-wrenching 9,613 souls. This makes the Gustloff, by far and away, the single worst maritime disaster in history, with a death toll more than double that of the second worst disasters, thinking of the Donna Paz in 1987, in which 4,386 souls were lost, and more than quadruple that of the Titanic's famous sinking in 1912, in which 1,496 were lost. But while figures are important for appreciating the scale of the disaster, we must not make the common mistake of dehumanizing the tragedy's victims and reducing them to mere statistics. Instead, we must remember that behind every single figure was a unique person, with their own hopes, fears, tragedies, and triumphs. So with that in mind, let's now take the time to have a look at the words of some of the survivors, as there's no better way to gain an appreciation of the human aspect of this tragedy than by looking at the words of those people themselves. We'll first start with an anonymous survivor who called herself simply Irene. She was only 11 years old when the Gustloff was sunk, and begins by recalling the torpedo impact, saying, "At about 9 p.m, we felt a thud and the ship listed. When the ship righted itself again, Mother took our hands and we made our way as quickly as possible upstairs onto the deck, which was a bit icy. We then felt 2 more hits. The ship listed more and more, and eventually we couldn't hold onto the railings anymore and slid onto the chimney of the ship before the waves then washed us into the sea. It was dark, of course, and there were already some lifeboats in the water with people in them, and they wouldn't let us hang on to the ropes swinging from the side. I don't blame them, though. I found my mother in the water and we swam to the rescue ship T-36. 2 ladders hung from the side of it going into lifeboats, so we climbed in and went up the ladder. It was difficult because our fingers wouldn't work from the cold of the water. I saw somebody operate on a woman's leg, which had a big hole in it, and most of the night I kept throwing up seawater. The next day we arrived at the Isle of Rügen. The sailors gave us their clothes, but we had no shoes and had to go through the snow barefoot. Eventually we got onto a Red Cross ship and Mother disappeared to look for my sister Ellen. She raced through and came across a room of crying kids who lost their mothers, and there sat my sister. She was traumatized by all of this. To this day, she does not like to speak about it, and she had a very hard time in school when it came to swimming. She could only go up to her waist in the water before she couldn't breathe and would panic. Irene's testimony is undoubtedly valuable, as seeing the disaster through the eyes of an innocent child has a certain blunt authenticity that you can't simply get from adult testimony. But clearly, she was so young that she didn't quite appreciate the finer details of the situation she found herself in. So now, for contrast, let's have a look at the testimony of an adult who survived the sinking, specifically that of Hans Rittner, a Kriegsmarine doctor who had been posted to the Gustloff. It was the equivalent of jamming 20 people into an average car. Entire families, some with 10 children, were fleeing. They were farmers, shopkeepers, labourers, lawyers, university professors, all kinds. Ordinary, average people. At first, we could billet families in rooms, expectant mothers in the dispensary, but every cabin filled and mattresses stretched from wall to wall in the passageways and public lounges. Even the swimming pool has become a tightly jammed dormitory for female auxiliaries. I was certain we struck a mine, but I was not alarmed. The Gustloff was big, and I was certain she would make sure. One of the other doctors then got frightened and left the cabin, and as he opened the door, I heard terror in the passageway. Women were shrieking, old men were moaning, and children were whimpering. I looked at the radium dial on my wristwatch and saw that it was 9:15 p.m. The emergency generator was dead, so I got up and put on my coat, making sure to put my pistol in my pocket. I left my cabin and struggled to keep my balance against the list, but tried to push my way through the clinging clusters of people. As I pushed, an old woman clutched my arm and asked if we were going to sink. I replied, "Of course not. And even if we do, the rescue boats will come at once and pull us from the water." I believed it too, even if the Gustloff was at a tremendous angle. I then headed to the deck and saw lifeboats clattering about. Not far from me, one careened across the slippery deck and crashed into a cluster of men and women. Then an officer hurried past me, crudely attempting to lean against the list, and shouted, "3 torpedoes! Soviet submarine! Almost all the crew is dead, either in the engine room or in their bunks." I then appreciated the seriousness of the situation and hurried below again to prepare an emergency kit with rations, toiletries, and a change of socks, etc. Then I heard water crashing in. It was unbelievable in its speed and volume. I checked for survivors and found hatches jammed shut by the explosion. The people couldn't open them, and I heard them pounding on the doors and desperately shrieking for help. Then I started to hear sharp pistol shots from within the cabins. As I made my way back to the deck, mothers called to me, "Where is my child?" As if I would know. They were clearly suffering from shock. I made it to a lifeboat and found myself beside a little girl. She recognized me as a medical man from my uniform and kept asking, "Mr. Doctor, where is my mummy? Where is my mummy?" But only the wind answered. And so ends the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, a once grand and luxurious liner, which is now naught but a tomb for nearly 10,000 poor unfortunate souls. Today she still lies where she fell. Classified as a war grave and noted as obstacle number 73 on Polish navigation charts, she is among the largest shipwrecks in the Baltic Sea. In an effort to prevent her victims from being defiled, the Polish government prohibits diving within a 500-meter radius around her. Tragically, this has not deterred interest, and from time to time, classless treasure hunters have pilfered her wreck for macabre trinkets, some of which, mercifully, have at least ended up in museums, but many more of which have been hidden away in private collections around the world. It's a sad end to a tale that's already so tragic that even in death, the Gustloff victims can't be afforded peace. But that's the world we live in. There is nothing we can do now but keep her memory alive and pray that her place at the top of the table is never superseded.